Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we're going in depth talking about how to get bass to feed no matter how cold the water gets. It's about drawing a core reaction, a feed response, how you can use a crankbait, a jerkbait, a blade bait, and a rig to trigger a feed response in the bass in the coldest water. In our last video, you guys came out with me on Lake Chickamauga. I had not been out in a while, but we went out power fishing. The water was cold, the air temps were freezing, there was ice all over the boat, but we were able to consistently get bit on a variety of reaction baits. We did not finesse fish, and we didn't throw just one thing. We threw all sorts of different baits, and were able to get bit on all of them. I sat down for a couple minutes on the boat in that video, and if you missed that video, I'll link it in the video description for you so that you can go and watch that one. But I sat down on the boat and gave a brief synopsis of this idea of triggering a reaction inside a bass. But today we're really going to talk about it. We're going to talk about why we use different baits to do different things to carry us through the entire winter so that you fully understand the concept. We've done videos on each one of these subjects, but today we're talking about how to use it as a system to consistently catch fish. Essentially, in the wintertime, there's three things that you can do. You can go out and you can finesse fish. Tim did a video on that last week. You can go out and you can throw giant baits and just try to catch a monster. And I talked about that a couple of weeks ago. The third way is triggering that feed response with a reaction bait. The power behind these baits this time of year in the cold water, and when I say cold water, let's say anything mid-50s all the way down to right above the water freezing solid, okay, anywhere in there. Now, I'll tell you the truth, I have never cranked one in 35-degree water. I just haven't had the opportunity yet. Do I think they'll eat it? 100%. But I have cranked them very successfully in 37-degree water. That's the coldest water that I've done it in now, and it worked beautifully. The reason that these baits can get a fish to eat is because it has nothing to do with them wanting to eat. Most of the things that we do when we go fishing, we're throwing a bait, we're trying to fool a bass. They're looking at your bait, you're moving it, they're following it. You're trying to get them to think that it's real and then to eat it. Each one of these baits, when fished appropriately, doesn't rely on that at all. It is about getting a core response. A bass is a predator. They react. They have a core reaction, and if you run a bait past them properly, they will respond. It's not about wanting to eat, it's the way they're wired. It doesn't matter if the water's 55 or 39, they react the same way. And that has been overlooked by bass fishermen from coast to coast for years. So, why do I have different baits? Let's get down to that really quickly. Essentially, each one has a job. My favorite way to catch these fish this time of year is to crank them. Typically, I'm throwing a deep crank. Okay, this is the Tactical DD. Tim and I designed this over the last few years. It's been on the market for a little over a year, but we designed it specifically for cold water cranking for triggering a feed response in bass. There are a couple other great crankbaits, and we did a completely in-depth video on this subject 2 months ago to get you guys started going into fall and winter. Again, if you missed that, I'll link that video in the description also. We really want you guys keyed up, understanding the concepts before the season even starts so that you don't lose any time. But here we are in the middle of winter. I want to make sure that you guys have got the concepts dialed so that you can get out on the water and have success day after day. So if I only have one choice, it's the crankbait. Okay, and I choose it for a variety of reasons. One, I can cover a ton of water. That's the biggest factor for me. I can cover a ton of water. I know if I run across them, I've got my system dialed. My gear is dialed, my retrieve is dialed. We use a combination of burning and pausing. So that bait's going full speed and then it stops. And then it takes off again and it stops. That is what gets that core feed response. And again, we've covered that in depth in that other video. But the deep crank, both our crank and a couple of others, and in the video description, I'll link the exact baits, not just the one Tim and I designed for this. I mean, we're not trying to get you to do something specific. I'll link you the other baits that are phenomenal. We use them in tandem to accomplish different jobs. But the deep crank is my favorite because in most lakes, not every lake, but in most lakes, those fish back down a little bit in the wintertime. You know, they're sitting between 10 and 20 feet of water, and that deep crank is perfect. Now, the other day, I also had a second group of fish. We ended the day deep cranking, but we started fishing very, very shallow. So I picked up this one, and this was one that I'd never thrown before. This is a balsa bait. It's a Rapala, Haute Defoe design. It's called his Garage Slim 6. That little guy right there. It's a balsa bait, tight actioned, made for cold water, but for a shallower scenario. So I was able to use these like a 1-2 punch, fishing deeper, fishing shallower. So my number one is cranking. It's just my passion, and I know if I run across a great big bass, I can draw that core reaction. The other one that's great for covering water is the A-rig. Okay, there are tons of A-rigs on the market. Tons of them, but they are not all the same. Just like with crankbaits, they're not all the same. There are people that will listen to Tim and I talk about cold water cranking over and over and over again, and then they'll go get in their crankbait box, pick out any old crankbait, it won't work, and they give it up. You have to understand that it is this detailed. The action of the bait has to be right. It has to be tight actioned. It's got to have the right sound profile to match what those fish are feeding on. Not every bait is the same. That's why we always say the exact same baits, and we only use a handful of colors. There is a small window that is near perfect for getting these fish to eat. And then there's all these other baits that are great at other times of year, but they are not dialed for cold water fishing. Well, A-rigs are the exact same way. Okay, there are tons of A-rigs on the market, but they're not all the same. Essentially, I carry two styles in the boat. I carry bladed and I carry non-bladed. The biggest thing that you need to know about an A-rig is whether or not it's flexible. Okay, we throw rigs that are extremely flexible. This is a Hog Farmer Flex. The other one is a G-Funk. Both of those are really flexible rigs. When you pump that rod, again, not just a straight retrieve. This is about triggering a core response. So it's a straight retrieve paired up with either hard rod twitches or hard reel pumps. And when you do that with a flexible rig, the entire rig will open up and close up, open up and close up. When you're reeling that thing and you do that, if a bass is following that school of bait fish and all of a sudden those bait fish split up and come back together, that tells the bass, I'm busted. Those bait fish know I'm here. It's time. And they take their shot. So that is why you see us working that rod so aggressively when we're throwing an A-rig. So an A-rig and a crankbait are both phenomenal for covering a lot of water to find those fish. Now, once you've found them, and that doesn't matter if you're on a boat flying down the bank, covering flats, going down bluff walls, or if you're walking the shoreline, making casts. Once you've found a grouping of fish, you can slow down. Depending on what those fish are doing and how cold the water is, there are 3 more baits that I turn to. Okay, first category is going to be the jerkbait. The jerkbait is, again, one of the very best ways to trigger a cold water fish into biting. Again, it's triggering. It's a bait that will sit in the water and then dart. And when it makes that change, those fish come after it. But we've preached this before. In the coldest of water, the jerkbaits have to be near perfect for it to work. Because the colder the water gets, when you're working your jerkbait, rip, 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 right? That thing's down there, darting, cutting. Then it sits. You give it time to pause. In warmer water, you might only give it a half a second or a second. So it doesn't really matter if the bait's not perfect and it's sinking a little or it's floating a little. It's not as big of a deal. But when the water's cold and you're pausing that thing for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, maybe longer, and it's sitting there, it has to sit there, right? If it's headed back to the surface, those fish are not going to take the time to follow that. But if that thing darts, 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 and pauses, and that fish is sitting here on the bottom, he'll slowly rise up to look at it, because that's not taking a lot of energy. And then when that thing darts, he's on it. Core reaction. That's the way it works. So the Vision 110 and the 110 plus one are my go-to baits. Essentially, this one runs shallower, this one runs deeper. Where are you fishing? How deep are your fish? That's how you decide. Now, the only other thing would be the 110 Junior and the 110 Junior plus one. It's just a smaller size. If you're fishing around smaller fish, or if the bait fish that you see in your lake throughout the year are a lot smaller, then I would throw the Junior instead of the standard 110s. But that's it. And again, we'll link all of this in the video description. I'll give you my favorite colors of my jerkbait, my favorite colors on my crankbaits, my favorite colors on my A-rigs, which weight heads we throw. All those things make a difference, and we'll give you all those details. Last two categories be a lipless and a blade bait. Okay, the lipless, now I'm not necessarily talking about chucking and winding. If it's a warm afternoon, the fish might come up to sun themselves and you might see me burning a lipless in the wintertime. But way more often, we're slow fishing it on the bottom. Almost like you're jig fishing. Pull it up, you'll feel it vibrate, and then you hold that rod and it'll crash back to bottom. Vibrate, crash back to bottom. It is the silliest presentation, but it works and it catches giants. Something about that combination of that vibration and that sound just gets monster bites. So we will throw that lipless in the cold water. But I will say, now this is an LV500. This is my favorite for this technique. The other one would be a Jackal TN70. Both are great baits for that bottom hopping. Now I'm not saying they're the only baits, but these are the baits that we have the most confidence in. And again, key colors. Like that guy there, that's Ghost Minnow. Coast to coast, we have been on so many lakes, and this just works. In this color, it just works. Now, as the water gets colder, there'll be a little bit of variation in water temperature, so I'm not going to call a set temperature. But as water gets colder, you'll find that that bite will just sort of fade away. They just won't do it. But they will continue to eat the exact same retrieve on a blade bait. Blade baits are essentially the same thing, but they're just stamped metal. Okay, so no rattle of any kind, just vibration. So it'll vibrate up, fall back to bottom. Vibrate up, fall back to bottom. Once it gets ultra cold, that sound just doesn't seem to work as well. Now, I always try it because there's something special about that combination of sound and vibration that gets the biggest bites. I mean, you might only get one bite, but maybe it's the fish of a lifetime. But if they truly will not eat it, if I've gone out and I've tried it and it's not happening, I go to the blade, because the blade will work in the coldest of water. There are a lot of really good blades, but I find more and more the two that I turn to day after day are these two right here. This is a Megabass, the Dyna Response. This is a Demiki, the Vault. The biggest difference is that the Demiki has a much more aggressive kick. When I pull that rod, it's thumping, right? It's really kicking hard. The Dyna response, see how it's got this, it's not a feathered tail, but essentially a feathered tail. It makes the action more muted. So when I pull that one, I still feel it vibrating, but it's, I mean, in one hand I've got this, and in the other hand I've got this. Okay, they're completely different vibrations. One is way more aggressive than the other. I find that on any given day, one of them is amazing, and it just flip-flops. So I carry both, I tie both on, I try both. You'll notice in a lot of our actual fishing videos in the last month or two, where we're out on the water and we pick up a blade bait, that you'll see us catch a couple on a Dyna response, and then the very next fish catch will be on a Demiki vault. Well, in between those two, we cut the one off, tied the other on to see, is I'm catching them on a Dyna response. If I switch to a vault, will I catch 10 times more or will I catch 10 times less? What is it today? So we're always switching, trying to fine tune exactly how much vibration they want on that day. Now, there are a lot of different blade baits, but those are just the two that I constantly find myself turning to. And in a blade this time of year, I really like a 1/2 ounce. That just seems to be my best result, typically because I'm fishing them deeper. So again, crankbaits, I've got a shallow option and a deep option, but my deep option is reaching a max depth of 18, 19 feet, okay? My A-rigs I can do anything with, but I typically fish shallower than 15. If I need to go deep, I can, but it's a whole lot less fun. Jerkbaits, I'm adapting to fish anywhere from a couple of feet down to 12 to 14 feet of water. Below that, I'm switching to the Lipless and the blade. And I can take those and draw that reaction response all the way down to 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 feet of water. So on a given lake, once you know how deep your fish seem to be sitting, because I'll show up to one lake and the fish all seem to be hanging in 10 to 20 foot. Not all of them, but the vast majority of them. Then I'll go to a highland reservoir and it's split. There's fish that are up there in 8 to 15, and there's fish that are in 30 to 40. And I've got baits that'll fish in both categories, right? So if you switch between different lakes, different fisheries, you need to pay attention to the right depth ranges that those fish just seem to be holding in. Because once you know that, you don't have to show up to the lake with everything tied on, right? If I know that I'm headed to a lake where my fish are in 30 feet of water, I've got an A-rig, and I've got a blade bait. It's that simple. If I know that my fish are going to be right up shallow, oh, it's going to be fun. I'm going to have all sorts of things tied on. Just go out there and try and get into some chaos. So you just adapt it. Now, with blade baits, one thing that I will say, the Dyna response has phenomenal hooks. I don't change those at all. But I do change the clip on top. That goes away, and I switch it to a Hyperwire number 3 split ring. That's the only change I make to that one. On the Demiki, I change hooks and the snap. And again, I'll link that stuff down in the video description for you, but you want to maximize your time on the water. Winter time is not the time to be messing around. It's not the time to have issues in your equipment because you tend to get less bites in the winter, but there's the opportunity for them to be giant fish. And you don't want to blow that. So really dial in your gear. Make sure your hooks are sharp. You guys saw that in the video on Wednesday where I started losing fish, and sure enough, my hooks had dulled from hitting bottom. Changed hooks and immediately got the best fish of the day, and it had a face full of hooks. It was hooked really well. So you've got to pay attention to those fine details this time of year because you don't want to go through the time and the effort and the cold to try and get a monster bite and then have something small throw you for a loop. Guys, hopefully this helps you. Hopefully this dials it in using different styles of baits, but all of them are about triggering a feed response. Burn, pause, pumping an A-rig, right? They all have a way of triggering a core reaction. If you're a finesse guy and you want to finesse, it will work. If you want to try and catch the biggest bass of your life on a swim bait, that will work. But if you want to get out there, have fun, trigger a feed response, and try and trigger a giant while catching a variety of fish, these will do that too. Winter is an amazing time to be on the water. There's less people. The overall size of fish is bigger. It's peaceful out there. It's cold, but it's peaceful. Get out there, give it a try, extend your fishing season into a whole new time of year, and I think you'll really enjoy it. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.